The silence in the Monroe mansion was a physical weight. It settled in the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, clung to the heavy velvet draperies that had not been properly cleaned in a year, and pooled in the hollows of the grand, empty rooms. Evelyn Monroe felt it most keenly in the library, a place that had once been the beating heart of their home. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's ambition, leather-bound volumes of philosophy and commerce, he no longer read. The silence screamed of failure. She ran a gloved finger along the spine of a book, leaving a clean streak in the fine layer of grey dust. Outside, the world roared on. The city thrummed with the frantic energy of the new decade, a symphony of screeching tires from Ford Model Ts, the distant, infectious pulse of jazz music spilling from hidden speakeasies, and a ceaseless chatter of a generation desperate to forget the war. But here, within the wrought iron gates of what was once one of the city's most respected estates, time had curdled. The melody of the roaring 20s was a faint, mocking echo. Evelyn was 21, possessing a quiet, porcelain beauty that seemed to belong to a more graceful era. Her dark hair was bobbed in the fashionable style, but she wore it with a classical severity that belied the carefree spirit of a flapper. There was a resilience in her violet blue eyes, a stark contrast to the fragility of her circumstances. She had watched, with a growing, helpless ache in her chest, as her father's shipping empire, once a titan of industry, crumbled into dust. Bad investments, a refusal to adapt to a changing world, and finally, the siren song of the gambling table had bled them dry. They were living on borrowed time, in a house that was no longer truly theirs. The sound of the front door closing, soft as a sigh, pulled her from her reverie. She heard her father's heavy, shuffling footsteps in the marbled entryway, the sound of a man carrying a burden far heavier than his own frame. She stepped out of the library to meet him. Stanley Monroe was a shadow of the man he had been. His once proud shoulders were slumped. His suit, though well made, hung loosely on his diminished form, and his eyes, the same shade of blue as his daughter's, were clouded with a perpetual storm of shame and fear. He avoided her gaze, focusing on placing his hat on a mahogany stand, as if it were the most important task in the world. "Father," Evelyn's voice was gentle, careful not to crack the fragile peace. "Just a difficult day at the bank, my dear," he mumbled, his back still to her. The lie was so thin it was transparent. He hadn't been to a bank for business in months. He'd been to darker places, making darker deals. "Is there news?" she pressed, stepping closer. "About the loans." He finally turned, and the raw despair on his face made her heart clench. "There is only one loan left that matters, Evelyn. The others, they were merely the prelude." He walked past her, into the drawing room, pouring a generous measure of whiskey into a crystal tumbler with a trembling hand. The liquor was from a dwindling private stock, a relic of better days. Evelyn followed him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She knew this was coming. The hushed, frantic telephone calls, the sold-off pieces of her mother's jewelry, the way her father would flinch at every unexpected knock on the door. It had all been building to this. "Who is it, father?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Who holds the final note?" Stanley took a long swallow of his drink, the amber liquid seeming to give him a sliver of courage. He sank into a worn armchair, the brocade fabric frayed at the arms. When he spoke the name, it was a ragged whisper, a curse breathed into the suffocating silence of the room. Corrigan. Arthur Corrigan. The name landed in the air like a stone. Evelyn felt a chill creep up her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn draft seeping through the window frames. Arthur Corrigan. His name wasn't printed in the society pages or whispered in the hallowed halls of finance. It was spoken in back alleys, in smoky jazz clubs, and by grim-faced policemen who knew better than to interfere. He was the king of the city's shadows, an emperor of bootleg gin and backroom deals, a man who had clawed his way from the gutter to a throng of illicit power. He was a gangster, a predator, and her father, in his desperation, had walked straight into the lion's den. "How much?" she asked, her throat suddenly dry. Her father didn't answer. He just shook his head, his eyes squeezed shut as if he could block out the truth. The amount didn't matter, she realized. To a man like Arthur Corrigan, a debt was not merely about money. It was about leverage. It was about ownership. As if summoned by the very mention of his name, a sharp, precise knock echoed through the house. It was not the familiar rap of the postman or a tradesman. This knock had an unnerving authority to it. Both Stanley and Evelyn froze. Stanley's face went ashen, the tumbler slipping from his nerveless fingers and shattering on the Persian rug, the dark whiskey spreading like a bloodstain. Their last remaining servant, a grim-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, appeared at the doorway. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Monroe," she announced, her voice flat, betraying no emotion. "He says it is urgent." A man stepped past her before Stanley could refuse. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit, his face a mask of cold indifference. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that was deeply unsettling. He was not the master, Evelyn knew instantly, but he was undoubtedly one of his wolves. His eyes, small and dark like chips of obsidian, swept the room, taking in the faded grandeur, the shattered glass, and Stanley's pathetic, trembling form. They rested on Evelyn for a moment, longer than was comfortable, a flicker of assessment in their depths that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Monroe," the man said, his voice as colorless as his expression. "Mr. Corrigan sends his regards. He has grown tired of waiting for a response to his letters. I need more time," Stanley stammered, trying to rise from his chair and failing. The man ignored him completely. He reached into his coat and produced a single crisp envelope of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. He did not hand it to Stanley. Instead, he placed it deliberately on the mantelpiece, a stark white rectangle against the dark carved wood. "Mr. Corrigan does not wish to discuss finances with you any longer," the man stated calmly. "He has extended an invitation for your daughter." Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. The room tilted, the ornate patterns on the wallpaper swimming before her eyes. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. She was not just a part of the debt, she was the settlement. "No," Stanley choked out, a flicker of his old paternal fire returning. "Absolutely not. You tell him, Mr. Corrigan is not a man one tells things to," the messenger interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "He will expect Miss Monroe at his establishment, the Velvet Shadow, tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. He wishes to finalize the terms of your arrangement in person." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, turned on his heel and was gone. The silence he left behind was 1,000 times more profound, 1,000 times more terrifying than the one that had preceded him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, a terrible, wrenching sob broke from Stanley Monroe. It was the sound of a man's soul breaking. He slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable grief. "I'm sorry," he wept, the words muffled and thick with self-loathing. "Oh, Evelyn, my sweet girl, what have I done? I'm so sorry." Evelyn stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the envelope on the mantelpiece. It was a summons, a bill of sale. Her father's apologies were just noise, the final, pathetic notes of a symphony of ruin he had composed himself. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but something else was rising through it, something sharp and clear and diamond, hard resolve. She would not be a weeping victim. She would not be a lamb led to slaughter. Her father had made this catastrophic mess, but he was too broken to see a way out. He would hide and weep until they came to drag him and her away. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the fireplace. Her hand was perfectly steady as she picked up the invitation. The cardstock was thick and expensive. The script inside she knew would be elegant. Men like Arthur Corrigan understood the power of appearances. They wrapped their brutality in silk. She looked at her father, a broken man, drowning in his own regret. She looked at her reflection in the gilded, tarnished mirror above the mantel, a pale, serious face with eyes that held the last spark of the Monroe fire. She was the price, the final payment, the only asset left. Very well. If she was to be sold, she would not be carried to the market. She would walk there herself, with her head held high. She would look the devil in the eye and discover, for herself, what he truly wanted. "Don't cry, father," she said, her voice a low, clear bell in the shattered quiet of the room. "I will go." The ride to the velvet shadow was a journey into another world. Evelyn sat ramrod straight in the back of a hired Ford T, the city lights smearing past the window in a dizzying, electric blur. She wore her finest dress, simple sheath of deep sapphire silk that had survived the family's financial cowl. It was a relic from a life of debutante balls and garden parties, now repurposed as armor for a descent into the underworld. A slim cloche hat was pulled low over her brow, shadowing her eyes, a futile attempt to hide the identity she was about to surrender. The driver, a man with a perpetually grim expression, followed the handwritten directions she'd given him, navigating a labyrinth of increasingly narrow streets until he stopped before a building that was utterly anonymous. There was no glittering marquis, no beckoning sign, only a single, unmarked black door set into a brick facade, flanked by two gas lamps that hissed softly, casting pools of amber light on the damp cobblestones. A lone, colossal figure stood sentinel beside it, his shoulders straining the fabric of his dark overcoat. "This is it, miss," the driver grunted, not bothering to turn round. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady the frantic beating of her heart, Evelyn stepped out of the car. The cool night air was a shock to her skin. As she approached, the doorman's eyes appraised her, his gaze missing nothing. He did not ask her name. He simply looked at her, saw the terror and resolve warring in her eyes, and seemed to understand. With a silent, almost reluctant nod, he opened the door. Evelyn stepped through, not into a hallway, but through a thick, sound-dampening velvet curtain. The change was instantaneous and overwhelming. The muted sounds of the city vanished, replaced by an explosion of life. The air was thick with the smells of spilled gin, expensive perfume, and the sweet, cloying smoke of Turkish cigarettes. A scintillating wave of jazz music washed over her, a saxophone crying a lament of love and loss, backed by the feverish, joyful rhythm of a piano. The velvet shadow was a cavern of secrets. The light was low, intimate, coming from shaded table lamps that cast a rosy glow on the faces of the patrons. And what faces they were! Politicians sat shoulder to shoulder with prize-fighters, their hushed conversations punctuated by the husky laughter of women in shimmering, beaded dresses, their hair cropped, their lips painted a defiant crimson. This was the city's beating, illicit heart, a place where fortunes were won and lost, and reputations were made and irrevocably shattered. Everyone here was hiding something, performing a role, and they all belonged to him. A man detached himself from the shadows near the entrance. He was the same messenger from her house. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice a low monotone. "This way." He led her not through the main room, but along a raised walkway at its edge. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all seemed to part before them. Heads turned. Eyes followed her, curious, envious, pitying. She felt like a specimen under glass, the latest acquisition for the club's owner. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the back of her guide's head, refusing to let them see her fear. He stopped before a heavy mahogany door at the far end of the club and knocked twice. A voice, low and resonant, answered from within. "Enter." The messenger opened the door and gestured for her to step inside, closing it silently behind her, leaving her alone with the devil. The office was as quiet as the club was loud. It was a sanctuary of controlled power. The walls were lined with books, just like her father's library, but these felt red, used. The air was laced with the rich, earthy scent of a recently extinguished cigar. A single green-shaded lamp on a massive oak desk cast a pool of light, leaving the rest of the room in deep, comfortable shadow. Through a tall window behind the desk, the city's lights glittered like a carpet of scattered diamonds. Arthur Corrigan was not standing to intimidate her. He was seated behind the desk, a silhouette against the city he so clearly owned. As she stepped into the light, he slowly looked up. Her mind had conjured images of a thugger, barrel-chested brute with scarred knuckles and a cruel sneer. The man before her was nothing of the sort. He was perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in a suit of such impeccable tailoring it seemed molded to his frame. His dark hair was slicked back from a high forehead, and his face was all sharp angles and stark planes, a face that could have been handsome were it not for the unnerving stillness of his expression. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of slate, dark and stormy, and they looked at her with an intelligence so piercing she felt he could see every thought, every fear, every secret she possessed. This was not a brute. This was a predator of a far more dangerous kind, one who wielded his mind as his primary weapon. "Miss Monroe," he said. His voice was the same one from behind the door, a low baritone with a rough edge, like velvet laid over gravel. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." He gestured to a leather armchair opposite the desk. Evelyn moved on legs that felt disconnected from her body and sat, perching on the edge of the seat. She placed her small purse in her lap, her gloved fingers gripping it as if it were a life raft. He watched her for a long moment, his silence a carefully calibrated tool of intimidation. "I trust your journey was untroubled." It was, she managed, her own voice sounding thin and foreign to her ears. "Good." He leaned forward slightly, his face entering the lamplight more fully. There was a faint scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the only visible mark of a violent life. "Let us not waste one another's time with pleasantries, Miss Monroe. We both know why you are here. Your father owes me a sum of money he is incapable of repaying. An astronomical sum my father made unwise decisions," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of its strength. She would not grovel. She would not weep. A flicker of something, perhaps respect, passed through his eyes. He did. He gambled on the wrong men and invested in the wrong ventures. He swam with sharks, and now he's bleeding. I am the largest of those sharks. He stated it as a simple fact, devoid of malice or pride. "What is it you want?" Evelyn asked, forcing herself to meet his unwavering gaze. "Surely the house, the land, it must be enough to cover a significant portion of the debt. The house is mortgaged to its last brick. The land is worthless without capital to develop it," he replied smoothly. "And I have no interest in becoming a landlord to a broken man. I am in the business of assets, Miss Monroe, not liabilities. Your father has become a liability." He paused, letting the cold words hang in the air. "You, however, you are an asset." The clinical, businesslike term sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. "I am not a piece of property to be traded." "No," he agreed, a surprising admission. "You are not. You are a Monroe. Your name, your breeding, your presence in this city, that still carries weight in certain circles. The circles I wish to enter, not as a guest, but as an equal." Now she understood. It wasn't just about money. It was about something he couldn't buy, steal, or threaten his way into: legitimacy. He had the power, the wealth, but he was still Arthur Corrigan, the gutter rat who'd built an empire of sin. He wanted a veneer of class, an entree into the old money world that despised and feared him. He laid his hands flat on the desk. They were large, clean hands, the knuckles unscarred. "So I will make you a proposal. I will absorb all of your father's debts, every last one. I will tear up the notes, call off the collectors. I will provide him with a modest stipend, enough to live out his days in quiet dignity. I will ensure no harm ever comes to him again. Your family's honor, what is left of it, will be restored. You will be safe. He will be safe." It was everything she had prayed for, an impossible rescue. But she knew the price was coming. She waited, her body tense. "In return," Arthur Corrigan said, his slate-gray eyes boring into hers, "you will become my wife." The word hung in the silent room. Monstrous and absolute wife. It was so much worse, so much more permanent than any other arrangement she had imagined. He didn't want a mistress. He wanted a name. He wanted to own her completely, to bind her to him with law and sacraments. A hysterical laugh almost bubbled up in her throat. She swallowed it down, tasting bile. "You want to marry me? A gangster wants to marry the daughter of the man he has ruined." "Precisely," he said, unfazed by her outburst. "It's poetic in its own way, a merger of the old world and the new. You will provide me with the respectability I require. I will provide you with the security you have lost. It is a perfectly balanced transaction." She stared at him, at his calm, impassive face. She thought of her father, a man so broken he could barely stand. She thought of the whispers and the pointing fingers, the slow, agonizing death of their family name. She had a choice: a swift, clean execution of her future, or a slow, painful decay for them both. There was no choice at all. "I see," she said, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, hard pragmatism. She had come here to face the beast. Now she would bargain with him. "If I agree to this transaction, I have one condition." He raised a single, scarred eyebrow. "I am not a man who accepts conditions. This one you will," she insisted, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "It will be a marriage in name. In public I will be Mrs. Corrigan. I will attend your functions. I will smile at your associates. I will play the part you require. But in private, we are to be strangers. You will not enter my bed. You will not touch me. It will be a marriage on paper. Nothing more." She held her breath, awaiting the explosion. She expected him to laugh, to mock her, to refuse. Instead, Arthur Corrigan leaned back in his chair, a slow, enigmatic smile finally touching his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "A marriage on paper only," he mused, as if tasting the words. "You asked to be a wife in title but not in truth. Very well, Miss Monroe. For now, your terms are acceptable." The words "for now" sent a fresh shiver of dread down her spine, but she had won her small, vital piece of ground. "Then you have your deal, Mr. Corrigan," she said, rising to her feet, desperate to escape the suffocating intimacy of the room. "I do," he confirmed, also standing. He was taller than she had realized, a truly imposing figure. He did not offer his hand. "My lawyer will call upon your father in the morning with the necessary documents. The wedding will be in 2 weeks. A quiet affair." She nodded, unable to speak. She turned and walked to the door, her back straight, her steps measured. As her hand touched the cold brass knob, his voice stopped her one last time. "Evelyn," he said. The sound of her given name from his lips was a brand. She turned her head slightly to look at him over her shoulder. "Welcome to the family." The Corrigan mansion was not a home. It was a statement. Perched high on a hill, overlooking the city, it was a sprawling monument of stone and glass, built with the cold, hard currency of fear and illegal gin. The marble floors of the entryway were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the light from a colossal crystal chandelier that hung like a frozen waterfall. The air smelled of lemon polish, old money, and an unnerving, sterile silence. It was, Evelyn thought as a silent butler took her single suitcase, the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. Her life fell into a strange, dislocated rhythm. She was the lady of a manor in which she had no authority. A staff of ghosts moved through the cavernous halls, cleaning, cooking, and serving with an efficiency that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. They addressed her as Mrs. Corrigan, their faces impassive, their eyes revealing nothing. They were his people, loyal to him, their silence a testament to his power. They were her wardens. Arthur himself was a phantom. He was gone before she awoke, his presence marked only by the faint scent of coffee and cigar smoke in the dining room where she ate her breakfast alone. He returned late, long after she had retired to a suite of rooms, a lavishly appointed sitting room, bedroom, and bath that were as far from his own quarters as the architecture of the house would allow. He was upholding his end of the bargain with a chilling precision. There were strangers living under one roof, two planets orbiting a sun of wealth and power, never touching, yet his presence was everywhere. One afternoon she found her closet, which had held her few remaining dresses, transformed. It was now filled with a breathtaking collection of new clothes, day dresses of fine wool and silk, evening gowns dripping with beads and sequins, delicate shoes for every occasion, and ropes of pearls lying coolly in velvet-lined boxes. There was no note, no explanation. It was the outfitting of a possession, the costuming of a role. He had purchased a wife, and now he was dressing her for the part. Another day, she discovered the mansion's library. It was twice the size of her father's, and stocked with first editions of works she had only ever dreamed of reading. She ran her fingers over the supple leather bindings, a familiar comfort in a profoundly alien world. He knew she loved books. The thought was as unsettling as it was intriguing. Had he investigated her? Or was it just a rich man's indiscriminate acquisitions? She didn't know which was worse. She spent her days there, losing herself in worlds of fiction to escape the gilded reality of her own. 2 weeks after the quiet, sterile ceremony at the City Hall that had officially made her Mrs. Arthur, Corrigan, a 10-minute affair witnessed only by his lawyer and his silent messenger, Arthur sought her out. She was in the library, curled in a wingback chair by the fire. When he appeared in the doorway, he was dressed for an evening out in a tuxedo that was a masterpiece of tailoring, its sharp lines making him seem even more formidable. "We have an engagement," he said, his voice cutting through the comfortable quiet. "A charity gala at the Sinclair Hotel. Be ready in an hour." It was not a request, it was a summons. Her first performance was about to begin. An hour later, she descended the grand staircase, wearing a shimmering, silver-beaded chemise dress that had appeared in her closet the day before. It fit her perfectly. As she reached the bottom step, Arthur was waiting. His slate-gray eyes swept over her, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. It wasn't warmth or admiration. It was appraisal. The look a man gives a prized racehorse before a competition. "You look acceptable," was all he said, turning and heading for the door. The Sinclair Hotel ballroom was a dazzling spectacle of light and sound. A jazz band played a frantic, joyful tune from a gilded balcony, while the city's elite mingled below, a glittering sea of jewels, tuxedos, and ambition. The air was thick with the scent of champagne and expensive gossip. The moment they stepped through the archway, a palpable change rippled through the room. It was as if a cold wind had blown in. Laughter died in throats. Conversations faltered. The river of people parted before them as they walked, creating a path where none had existed. Evelyn felt hundreds of eyes on her, and for the first time, she truly understood the nature of her husband's power. It wasn't just influence, it was a physical force. The men who looked at Arthur did so with a carefully masked fear, their smiles tight, their handshakes too quick. They saw the gangster beneath the fine suit. The women were worse. Their eyes raked over Evelyn, filled with a venomous cocktail of curiosity, envy, and contempt. She was an outsider, a Monroe, from a family now in ruins. How had she, of all people, ensnared the city's most dangerous and elusive bachelor? They saw her as an opportunist, a gold digger who had sold her name for the Corrigan fortune. In a way, they were right. The judgment in their gazes was a physical blow, and she instinctively moved a half-step closer to Arthur's side. He was the cause of her torment, but in that moment, he was also her only shield. "Smile," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. "They are paying for this spectacle. We should give them their money's worth." She forced her lips into a brittle smile, feeling like a doll on display. And then through the crowd, she saw a familiar face. A face from her old life. Walter Sterling. He was the scion of a banking family, a man who had courted her with flowers and poetry the summer before her father's world had collapsed. He was handsome, charming, and everything her parents had hoped for in a son-in-law. When their fortune had vanished, so had he. He was making his way toward them now, his expression a mask of handsome concern. He bypassed Arthur completely, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, melodious balm. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her glove. "I couldn't believe it when I heard the news. I had to see for myself that you were, well," the unspoken words hung in the air between them, "that you were safe, that you were not a prisoner." "I am perfectly well, Walter. Thank you," she replied, her voice cooler than she intended. She gently withdrew her hand. Arthur had turned, his body language shifting from passive observation to a state of quiet, predatory stillness. He looked at Walter, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes were cold as a winter sky. Walter finally acknowledged him, extending a hand. "Sterling. Walter Sterling. I'm an old friend of Evelyn's family." Arthur took the offered hand, his grip firm and brief. "Corrigan," he said, as if the name were a complete biography. "We're surprised to see you here," Walter continued, his gaze returning to Evelyn, full of practiced sincerity. "One hears so many stories. It's good to see you looking so splendid. This life seems to agree with you." His tone was light, but his eyes held a deep, pitying sorrow that made Evelyn's stomach tighten. He was acting as if he was speaking to a hostage. "My wife is adaptable," Arthur answered for her, his voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying edge of steel. "It is one of her many charms." The word wife was a clear, deliberate brand, a warning. Walter gave a tight, understanding smile. "Of course. Well, Evelyn, it's wonderful to see you. You know, if you ever need anything at all, an old friend is always here for you." He gave her one last meaningful look before nodding curtly at Arthur and melting back into the crowd. The encounter left Evelyn trembling. Walter's feigned compassion had cut deeper than the scornful glares of all the women in the room. He had reminded her of the world she had lost, of the life she was supposed to have. He had planted a seed of an idea she had been trying to suppress, that she needed saving, that this was not a transaction, but a damnation. For the rest of the evening, she moved through the motions in a daze. She smiled, she nodded, she allowed Arthur to rest his hand on the small of her back, a gesture of ownership that sent a jolt, not of intimacy, but of cold possession, through the fabric of her dress. The ride home in Arthur's gleaming black Duesenberg was shrouded in a heavy silence. The city lights slid by, but Evelyn saw nothing. She was trapped in her thoughts, Walter's concerned face floating in her mind. As the car purred through the gates of the estate, Arthur finally spoke, his voice quiet in the darkness of the car. "Stay away from him." Evelyn turned to look at him, his face half hidden in shadow. "Walter, he is an old friend." "He is a snake," Arthur replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "His family wanted to partner with your father's shipping business a year ago. When your father refused, Sterling's bank called in a series of loans that started the cascade of your family's ruin. His concern is not for you. It is a performance. Evelyn stared at him, stunned into silence. She had known nothing of this. Walter, the charming poet, the gentleman caller, had been a vulture circling her family from the start. He sees you as a vulnerability, Arthur continued, his eyes on the approaching mansion. My vulnerability. He is mistaken. But I will not have him testing the theory. They pulled to a stop before the grand entrance. The silent butler was already there, opening the door. Arthur got out, but before Evelyn could move, he leaned back in. You made a bargain, Evelyn, he said, his voice a low, final warning. You are Mrs. Corrigan now. Do not forget what that means, and do not forget who your enemies are. He closed the door, leaving her alone in the opulent silence of the car. She looked up at the great house, its windows blazing with light, like 100 unblinking eyes. It wasn't just a gilded cage, it was a fortress, and she was beginning to realize that the dangers outside its walls might be just as terrifying as the man who resided within. The weeks that followed the gala settled into a rigid, suffocating routine. Evelyn lived within the mansion's walls, a ghost haunting its opulent corridors. She read, she walked the manicured gardens, she took her meals in solitary splendor. Arthur remained a distant, nocturnal creature, a man who shared her name but not her life. The gilded cage was secure, its bars polished and gleaming, and the loneliness was a constant, aching presence. The change came, as it so often does, with the sudden, shocking intrusion of violence. It was a Tuesday night, late. A storm was raging outside, rain lashing against the tall library windows in furious sheets. Evelyn was lost in a novel, the crackling of the fire, her only companion, when a commotion erupted in the entryway. Raised voices, sharp and anxious, cut through the house's usual hush. Then the heavy sound of the front doors being thrown open and slammed shut. Evelyn's heart leapt into her throat. She put her book down, her hands suddenly clammy, and moved cautiously to the library door, cracking it open just enough to see. Two of Arthur's men she recognized from the periphery of her life. Their faces, hard and watchful, were helping him into the house. Arthur was leaning heavily on one of them, his impeccable suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained a shocking, dark crimson along one sleeve and shoulder. His face was pale and drawn, his jaw set in a line of controlled pain. Standing beside them, looking panicked, was the silent messenger, whose name she now knew was Clarence. "Get the doctor. Now," Clarence snapped at a hovering maid, his usual composure completely shattered. "And tell no one." Arthur straightened up, shaking off the support of his man with a grunt of effort. "I'm fine," he growled, the words tight with pain. "It's a graze, boss. It's more than a graze," the other man argued. A rival crew hit the docks warehouse. They were waiting for the shipment. Arthur waved a dismissive hand, then winced as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "I'll handle it tomorrow. Everyone out. Go." His voice held the raw, undisputed authority of a commander on a battlefield. The men hesitated for a fraction of a second, then vanished as silently as they had appeared, leaving Arthur alone in the vast, echoing hall. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly on his feet, his head bowed. In that instant, stripped of his entourage and his aura of invincibility, he looked starkly, terrifyingly human. He pushed a hand through his rain-soaked hair and began to walk, not toward the grand staircase that led to his wing, but unsteadily toward the library, toward her. Evelyn's instinct was to retreat, to flee back to the safety of her chair and pretend she had seen nothing. It was his world, his violence, his pain. It had nothing to do with their arrangement. But she didn't move. She watched, frozen, as he stumbled into the library, making a beeline for a decanter of brandy on a side table. His hands were shaking as he tried to pour a drink, A sharp, ragged gasp of pain escaped his lips as he moved his injured arm. He leaned against the table, his eyes squeezed shut, the color draining from his face. And in that moment, the carefully constructed walls between them, the contract, the cold distance, the fear, crumbled into dust. He was not the gangster, the monster, the kingpin. He was just a man, bleeding and in pain, in his own home. "Let me help you," she said, her voice startlingly clear in the quiet room. Arthur's eyes snapped open. He hadn't known she was there. He straightened instantly, his mask of stoicism falling back into place. "I don't need your help. Don't be a fool," she retorted, surprising herself with her own forcefulness. She crossed the room, her fear replaced by a strange, urgent sense of purpose. "You're bleeding through your shirt. The doctor is coming, but that needs to be cleaned now." He stared at her, his slate-gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suspicion. He seemed about to refuse, but a fresh wave of dizziness made him grip the edge of the table. He gave a short, defeated nod. Evelyn guided him to the large leather sofa near the fire. "Take off your shirt," she commanded softly. He hesitated, then began to unbutton it with his good hand, his movements clumsy and slow. She helped him, her fingers brushing against his skin. It was warm, alive. The reality of it was a small shock. When the shirt was open, she saw the damage. A crude, bloody bandage was hastily wrapped around his upper arm and shoulder. Blood had soaked through it, stark and vivid against its pale skin. She hurried to a small washroom adjoining the library and returned with a bowl of warm water and clean towels. Kneeling before him on the rug, she began to carefully unwrap the bandage. The wound was a deep, ugly gash along the curve of his shoulder, a bullet graze that had torn the flesh. It was raw and angry. He hissed in pain as she began to gently clean it, but he did not pull away. They worked in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the hiss of the rain against the glass. The air was charged with a strange, unprecedented intimacy. She was touching him, tending to him. Her world was intersecting with his in a way their vows never had. "They tried to kill you," she whispered, her gaze fixed on her task. "It comes with the territory," he answered, his voice rough. She looked up, meeting his eyes. He was watching her, his expression unguarded for the first time. The usual hardness was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability and a deep, weary exhaustion. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you live like this?" He was silent for a long time, watching the firelight play on the water in the bowl. "When you grow up with nothing," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly, "you learn that there are two kinds of people in the world, those who eat and those who are eaten. I decided a long time ago which one I was going to be." He looked at her, and his eyes held the ghosts of 1,000 street fights, of a hunger she could never comprehend. "My father was a good man, an honest dock worker. He broke his back for pennies and died of pneumonia in a tenement that wasn't fit for rats. Honesty got him an early grave. I chose a different path." She finished cleaning the wound, her touch gentle. She saw it then, not an excuse for his brutality, but an explanation. A crack in the armor, revealing the angry, wounded boy beneath. The doctor arrived, a discreet, grim-faced man who asked no questions. He stitched the wound, applied a fresh dressing, and left a bottle of laudanum for the pain. By the time he was gone, Arthur was slumped against the sofa cushions, his face ashen, his energy completely spent. Evelyn hesitated. "You should go to bed." He gave a weak, humorless laugh. "I think the stairs might be a challenge too far tonight." Without a word, she retrieved a pillow and a thick cashmere blanket from a nearby chest. She gently lifted his head and slid the pillow beneath it, then draped the blanket over him. His eyes, clouded with pain and exhaustion, followed her every move. He did not object. He did not speak. He simply watched her. She pulled a small footstool closer to the sofa and sat down, intending to keep vigil until she was sure he was safely asleep. She looked at his face in the flickering firelight, the hard lines softened by sleep, the scar on his eyebrow, a pale silver crescent. The monster was gone. All that was left was Arthur. A few days later, he was still recovering, his arm in a sling, a grim moodiness having settled over the house. One bright, crisp autumn afternoon, he found her in the garden. "Come with me," he said. It was not a command, but an invitation. She followed him to the garage, where his prized Duesenberg sat, alongside a more modest Ford Model T. He gestured to the Ford. "Get in." He drove, steering with his good arm. They left the manicured lawns of the wealthy behind, heading into the heart of the city, toward the crowded, working-class neighborhoods she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. The streets grew narrower, the buildings grittier. He pulled to a stop outside a large plain brick building. It was a children's home, the St. Jude's orphanage. "What are we doing here?" she asked, confused. "A business meeting," was all he said. A nun with a kind, weathered face greeted them at the door. Her smile when she saw Arthur was one of genuine warmth and affection. "Arthur, it is so good to see you. And you've brought a friend. Sister Agnes, this is my wife, Evelyn," Arthur said. The nun's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with pleasure. "A pleasure to meet you, my dear. Any wife of our greatest benefactor is a friend to us." Evelyn stared at Arthur, completely bewildered. Benefactor? Inside, the orphanage was clean and bright, filled with the sounds of children's laughter. Sister Agnes explained that a mysterious donor had paid for a new furnace last winter, had funded a new library wing, and provided a steady, anonymous supply of fresh food and warm clothes. Arthur said nothing. He walked through the halls, his movements stiff and awkward, as small children ran up to him, tugging on his coat, their faces alight with hero worship. He softened in their presence, a change so profound it was almost shocking. He knelt down to speak to a small boy with a cough, his large hand resting gently on the child's shoulder, his voice a low, comforting rumble. Evelyn watched from a distance, her heart doing a strange, unfamiliar flutter. She was seeing a secret part of him, a piece of his soul that he kept hidden from the world, buried beneath layers of violence and fear. This was where his money went, not just to clothes and cars and mansions, but to this, to them. On the silent drive home, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Evelyn looked at the man beside her, the fearsome gangster, the cold businessman, the wounded man by the fire, the secret saint to 100 orphans. He was a paradox, a complex and dangerous mosaic of darkness and an utterly unexpected light. She had agreed to marry a monster to save her family, but she was beginning to suspect she'd married a man instead. And that, she realized with a sudden, terrifying jolt, was an infinitely more dangerous proposition. The brief thaw between them was as fleeting as an Indian summer. Arthur retreated back into his shell of silence and distance, the vulnerability he'd shown in the library locked away as securely as the cash in his vaults. The incident at the orphanage was never mentioned again, leaving Evelyn to wonder if she had imagined the entire thing. The mansion reverted to its state of quiet, orderly loneliness, but for Evelyn, something had irrevocably changed. Her fear of him had begun to curdle into a restless, aching curiosity. Who was Arthur Corrigan, really? Her search for answers began with the house itself. It was a labyrinth of rooms, most of which she had never entered. One rainy afternoon, driven by a profound boredom and a burgeoning sense of entitlement, it was, after all, her house she began to explore. She drifted through silent, dust-sheeted guests' bedrooms and unused parlors, each one as impersonal as a hotel. Then, at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor in the west wing, a part of the house she had instinctively avoided, she found a locked door. It was different from the others. It was a simple, unadorned oak door, but the brass knob was tarnished from lack of use, and a stillness, emanated from it that felt older and deeper than the silence in the rest of the house. Piqued, she tried the handle. It was locked fast. Over the next few days, the door became an obsession. It was a tangible secret in a house full of intangible ones. One morning, while the head housekeeper was distracted by a delivery, Evelyn slipped into the woman's office. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she sifted through a large ring of antique skeleton keys. She took 3 that looked promising, her fingers trembling. The third key worked. With a rusty groan of protest, the lock turned. Evelyn pushed the door open and stepped into a room where time had stopped. It was a woman's bedchamber, but unlike her own modern suite, this one was preserved in the style of a decade prior. A heavy 4-poster bed dominated the room, its brocade canopy faded but still beautiful. A silver-backed brush and comb set lay on the dressing table, as if their owner had just set them down. A half-finished piece of embroidery sat in a hoop by the window, a single needle still threaded with blue silk. The air was thick with the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and dust. A profound sense of trespass washed over Evelyn. This was not just a room, it was a shrine. Her eyes were drawn to a collection of silver-framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Most were of a young woman, alone or with friends. She was beautiful, with a cascade of dark curls and a smile that radiated an infectious, carefree joy. In one photograph, she was standing beside a much younger Arthur. He looked barely 20, his face leaner, hungrier, but his eyes, fixed on the girl beside him, held a look of such unguarded, absolute adoration that it stole Evelyn's breath. This was an Arthur she could not have imagined, a boy deeply, incandescently in love. On the nightstand beside the bed lay a leather-bound book of poetry. Evelyn picked it up. The inscription on the inside cover, in a bold, masculine hand, read, "To my Beatrice, my sun, my moon, my stars. Forever yours, a Beatrice." The name was a whisper, a key that unlocked a devastating understanding. Evelyn sank onto the edge of the dusty chaise lounge, her mind reeling. She was not the first Mrs. Corrigan. She was a replacement. Arthur's strange, respectful distance, his refusal to touch her, the separate bedrooms, it wasn't about their bargain. It was about her, about this ghost who still owned his heart, whose memory was so sacred that he had sealed her room like a tomb. Every gesture of kindness he had shown her, the books, the quiet concern, was instantly recast in a new, painful light. Was he seeing Beatrice when he looked at her? Was her presence in this house simply a way for him to pretend that the woman he truly loved had never left? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. She was a stand-in, a pale imitation of the vibrant, laughing girl in the photographs. The click of the door opening behind her made her jump, her blood turning to ice. Arthur stood in the doorway. His face, when he saw her in the room, transformed into a mask of cold, devastating fury. It was a rage more terrifying than any she had seen before, because it was born not of violence, but of a profound, soul-deep pain. "Get out," he said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, the book of poetry falling from her lap and hitting the floor with a soft thud. I'm sorry. The door was unlocked," I said. "Get out," he repeated, taking a step into the room. The air crackled with his anguish. He looked past her, at the disturbed dust, at the book on the floor, and a look of such utter desolation crossed his features that she felt it like a physical blow. She fled. She ran from the room, down the long corridor, the sound of him slamming the door behind her echoing like a gunshot. She didn't stop until she reached the sanctuary of her own suite, where she collapsed onto her bed, her body racked with trembling sobs. The gilded cage had suddenly become unbearable, its bars forged not from his power, but from his undying love for another woman. The next day, a package arrived for her. It was delivered by a messenger, not one of Arthur's men. Inside was a single, perfect white rose and a note written on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. "Evelyn, I was so sorry to see you looking distressed at the gala. A beautiful woman should never be sad. If you should ever need a friend to talk to, or an escape from your gilded cage, I am always at your service. Yours, Walter." His timing was impeccable. His words were a balm on her raw, wounded pride. He had seen her as an eveling, not as a replacement for a ghost. She clutched the note, the memory of his handsome, concerned face a stark contrast to Arthur's cold, wounded fury. Her opportunity came 2 days later. Arthur was gone, called away to Atlantic City on urgent business. The house was emptier and more silent than ever. Driven by a desperate need to breathe free air, to escape the suffocating presence of Beatrice's ghost, Evelyn did something she had not done since her marriage. She left the grounds alone. She sent a telegram to the address Walter had provided. A simple message: the Plaza Fountain, 3 o'clock. He was waiting for her, looking dashing in a camel hair coat, his smile as warm and inviting as she remembered. He bought her a hot coffee from a vendor, and they walked, the crisp autumn air a welcome shock to her senses. "I was so worried about you," he said, his voice laced with practiced sincerity. "Corrigan has a reputation. They say he's ruthless, that he's cold as ice." "He is a complicated man," Evelyn said, her voice small. "Complicated?" Walter scoffed gently. "Evelyn, he's a criminal. Did you know what happened to his first love, a girl named Beatrice?" Evelyn's heart stopped. I know her name." Walter steered her to a secluded bench, his expression turning grave. "It was a tragedy. She was a sweet girl from the wrong side of the tracks. She got caught up in his world. He was in a turf war with another gang. They used her to get to him. She was killed in the crossfire of a shootout he started. He couldn't protect her then, and he can't protect you now. That world, it consumes everything it touches." His version of the story was a twisted, poisoned dart, aimed directly at her deepest fears. It painted Arthur not as a grieving lover, but as a reckless monster whose ambition had led to Beatrice's death. "He keeps a room for her," Evelyn whispered, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "Like a shrine." Walter's eyes filled with a theatrical pity. "Oh, my dear girl, you see, you're just a ghost to him, a placeholder for the woman he lost. You deserve so much more than that. You deserve to be cherished for who you are." He took her hand. "Let me help you. You don't have to stay there. I can get you away. We can go somewhere far from here, start a new life." His offer was a life raft in a stormy sea. He was offering her an escape, a return to a world where she was seen, where she was cherished. Confused, heartbroken, and deeply afraid, she looked into his kind, handsome face and saw a savior. That night, when Arthur returned from his trip, the house was dark and cold. He walked into the library, a small, velvet-covered box in his hand. He had intended to apologize for his anger, to try and explain, but the room was empty. He went to her suite. The door was ajar. Her bed was made. Her books were neatly stacked, but the closets were open, and they were empty. On the pillow lay a single white, wilting rose. He knew instantly who it was from. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, colder and sharper than any bullet. He had built walls of steel and stone to protect her from his world, but he had never thought to protect her from himself. His grief, his past, his inability to speak the truth, they had driven her away, and she had run straight into the arms of the only man he truly considered an enemy. Arthur Corrigan stood in the silent, empty room, the unopened gift crushing in his fist, and for the first time in over a decade, he felt the terrifying, paralyzing grip of true fear. The drive away from the city felt like a fever dream. Evelyn sat beside Walter in his sleek Packard, the powerful engine eating up the miles of dark country road. He held her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, in what was meant to be a comforting gesture, but it felt strangely proprietary. He spoke of a new life in a small, quiet town up north, of a cottage by a lake, of a world where the name Corrigan was just a bad memory. It was everything she thought she wanted: escape, peace, a life returned to her. Yet a cold, persistent unease coiled in the pit of her stomach. She had packed in a blind flurry of grief and anger, Walter's poised words echoing in her ears. Arthur hadn't loved her. He had used her as a placeholder for his ghost. The escape Walter offered was a balm to her wounded heart, a chance to reclaim herself. But now, in the humming darkness of the car, the logic of her actions began to fray. She had run from a man who funded orphanages and had shown her a startling, hidden gentleness toward a man who had helped orchestrate her family's ruin. The thought was a dissonant chord in the symphony of her flight. They stopped at a secluded, run-down motor lodge an hour outside the city. "Just for the night," Walter explained with a charming smile. "We'll get an early start tomorrow. Best not to be seen traveling too late." He secured two adjoining rooms. The moment the door to her room closed, the lock clicking shut with a grim finality, the charming mask began to slip. "Give me your purse, Evelyn," he said, his tone no longer gentle. It was flat, commanding. "Why?" she asked, clutching the small bag to her chest. He sighed, an exaggerated sound of impatience. He stepped forward and simply took it from her, his grip surprisingly strong. He emptied its contents onto the grimy bedspread: a handkerchief, a tube of lipstick, a few dollars. He tossed the purse aside. "Just making sure you didn't do anything foolish, like bring jewelry or try to contact anyone." The unease in her stomach sharpened into a blade of pure fear. "Walter, what are you doing? You're frightening me." He turned to her, and the kind, compassionate man from the plaza was gone. In his place was a stranger with cold, calculating eyes. "Don't be naive, Evelyn. Did you really think this was about saving you? A cottage by the lake?" He let out a short, cruel laugh. "You are far more valuable than that." Her blood ran cold. "Valuable? What are you talking about?" "You are Arthur Corrigan's wife," he said, the words dripping with venomous satisfaction. His one, beautifully crafted, high society weakness. He built an empire, but he couldn't buy class, so he bought you. And now I am going to use his prized possession to tear that empire down. The horrifying truth crashed down upon her. She was not being rescued. She was being traded. She had fled one cage, only to be willingly led into another, far smaller and more terrifying. You're going to ransom me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Ransom is such an ugly word," Walter sneered. "Let's call it a hostile takeover. I've sent him a telegram. He has two choices. He can transfer ownership of his entire shipping and bootlegging operation on the Eastern docks to me, or he can have his pretty, porcelain wife returned to him in pieces." He smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "Either way, I win." He saw the horrified defiance in her eyes. "Don't even think about screaming. No one will hear you, and no one will help you." He stepped out of the room, and she heard the key turn in the lock from the outside. She was a prisoner. Back in the city, Arthur stood in the dead quiet of Evelyn's empty room. The single wilting white rose on the pillow was a declaration of war. He did not rage. He did not break things. The panic that had seized him earlier now cooled, solidifying into something diamond, hard and lethal. He had spent his life controlling his world through force and intimidation, but he had failed to control the one thing that mattered. He had let his past poison his present, and now the wolf was at the door. Clarence appeared, his face grim. "Boss, a telegram arrived." Arthur took the slip of paper. The message was brutally simple, a list of demands and a location: the old cannery at Pier 12. "Midnight. Come alone." A cold, calculated fury settled over him. This wasn't about business. This was about Walter Sterling's festering jealousy and ambition. He had seen Evelyn not as a person, but as a key way to unlock the empire Arthur had built. Arthur had made the same mistake. He had seen her as an asset, a piece of a puzzle. He had never told her that the shrine to Beatrice was a monument to his guilt, not his love. He had never explained that Beatrice had died because he had been young and reckless, and he had sworn never to let his heart endanger anyone again. And, in keeping that vow, he'd erected a wall between himself and Evelyn, a wall that had driven her into the arms of a snake. His feelings for her, the ones he had so brutally suppressed, now roared to the surface. It wasn't the shadow of an old love. It was new, terrifying, and absolute. It was the quiet way she sat in the library, the fire in her eyes when she defied him, the gentle, unexpected touch of her hands as she cleaned his wound. He had married her for convenience, but somewhere along the way, she had become his reason. "Get the men," Arthur said to Clarence, his voice dangerously quiet. "All of them. We're going to war." The old cannery on Pier 12 was a skeletal wreck, smelling of brine and decay. Evelyn sat on a wooden crate in the center of the vast, cavernous space, her hands tied behind her back. Walter paced before her, a silver flask in one hand, a pistol in the other. He had brought 2 hired thugs with him, brutish men who watched the doors with vacant eyes. "He'll be here soon," Walter said, more to himself than to her. "He's arrogant. He'll think he can handle this himself." Evelyn looked at him, her fear now eclipsed by a burning contempt. "You're a coward, Walter. You hide behind other men's guns and use a woman as a shield. He may be a gangster, but he is 10 times the man you will ever be." Walter's face contorted in a flash of rage. He backhanded her, the force of the blow snapping her head to the side, splitting her lip. "You will learn your place." At that precise moment, the main doors of the cannery burst inward, ripped from their rusty hinges by the front bumper of a roaring Duesenberg. The car screeched to a halt in the center of the warehouse, its headlights cutting through the gloom like twin searchlights, pinning Walter and his men in their glare. The driver's side door opened. Arthur Corrigan stepped out, not into the light, but remaining a silhouette against it. He was alone, but he did not look like a man coming to negotiate. He looked like an executioner. "Sterling," Arthur's voice boomed, amplified in the cavernous space. "Let her go. This is between you and me." Walter laughed, a high, nervous sound. He grabbed Evelyn, hauling her to her feet and pressing the cold barrel of his pistol to her temple. "You came alone, you fool. You see, Corrigan, you always lose the things you care about. First Beatrice, now her. Let her go," Arthur repeated, each word a chip of ice. He took a slow step forward. "Stay back," Walter shrieked, his composure cracking. "Or I swear I'll kill her. The docs. Sign them over to me now." "You think this is about the docs?" Arthur said, taking another step. For the first time, Evelyn saw the raw, untamed emotion on his face. It was anguish. It was fury. It was a terrifying, all-consuming love. "You can have the docks. You can have the city. It's all just brick and steel. Give her back to me." He was giving it all up, for her. The realization struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. The empire he had bled for, killed for it, meant nothing compared to her safety. Walter stared, momentarily stunned by the offer. It was more than he had ever hoped for. But in that moment of hesitation, his greed warred with his hatred. It wasn't enough to win. He had to see Arthur utterly destroyed. "No," Walter hissed, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. "I think I'll take both." As he spoke, the shadows at the edges of the warehouse came alive. From behind stacks of crates and rusted machinery, Arthur's men emerged, silent as ghosts, each one holding a Thompson submachine gun. The 2 thugs Walter had hired dropped their weapons instantly, their hands flying into the air. Walter froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had walked into a perfectly laid trap. He was surrounded. "You have one last chance, Sterling," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a deathly calm. "Let go of my wife." Panic seized Walter. His triumphant fantasy crumbled into dust. He shoved Evelyn away from him and fired a wild shot in Arthur's direction. Time seemed to slow down. Evelyn saw the flash from the barrel, heard the deafening crack. She saw Arthur stagger back, a dark stain blossoming on his side. But even as he fell to one knee, he was pulling his own gun from inside his coat. Before Walter could fire again, the warehouse erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire as Arthur's men opened fire. Walter's body was thrown backward by the sheer force of the bullets, his face a mask of shock as his pathetic, cowardly life was extinguished. The sudden silence was as shocking as the noise. Evelyn scrambled over to Arthur, who was clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. His men rushed forward. "Get her out of here," Arthur grunted, his face pale with pain. Clarence gently but firmly took Evelyn's arm. She resisted, her eyes locked on Arthur. "No, I'm not leaving him." Arthur looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate light. "Evelyn, go, please." It was the first time he had ever said please to her. She allowed Clarence to lead her out of the carnage, her mind a maelstrom of terror and a shocking, overwhelming realization. He had risked it all. He had been willing to give up his empire, to walk into a trap, to take a bullet. Not for an asset, not for a placeholder, for her. The grandfather clock in the entryway chimed 3, its mellow, sonorous tones marking the deepest hour of the night. Rain whispered against the windows of the library, a gentle, cleansing sound that seemed to be washing the city and the world clean. A low fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the two figures seated on the sofa. The air, which for so long had been thick with silence and unspoken truths, was finally, blessedly still. Evelyn held a porcelain cup of warm broth, watching Arthur as he slowly sipped his own. A thick, clean bandage was wrapped around his torso, a stark white slash against the dark silk of his dressing gown. The doctor had come and gone, extracting the bullet and declaring, with a grim sort of professional admiration, that Mr. Corrigan was made of sterner stuff than most men. The wound was serious, but it would not be fatal. After Clarence had brought her back to the mansion, a frantic, nerve-shredding hour had passed while she waited for news. When Arthur had finally walked through the door pale, leaning on 2 of his men, but alive, the relief that washed over her was so profound it left her weak. She had dismissed the household staff, and for the first time, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, they were truly alone. She had tended to him herself, changing his dressing with steady hands, her movements gentle and sure. He had watched her, his slate-gray eyes filled with an emotion so raw and intense it made her heart ache. The barriers between them, the contract, the ghost of Beatrice, the fear, had been burned away in the fire and thunder of the cannery. All that was left was the truth. "The first time I saw you," Arthur said, his voice a low, raspy murmur that was hoarse with pain and exhaustion, "was at a fundraiser a year ago, before your father's troubles. You were standing by a window, talking about a book with an old professor. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You weren't flirting or looking for a husband. You were just alive, real, in a room full of counterfeit people." Evelyn looked at him, her own cup forgotten. She remembered that night, a lifetime ago. She had never even noticed him there, a shadow in the corner of the room. "I had just lost Beatrice," he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire, looking into the past. "Walter was right about one thing. It was my fault. I was young, arrogant. I thought I could have her in my world and keep her safe. I was wrong. Her death, it hollowed me out. I built this empire, this fortress around myself, and swore I would never let anyone close enough to get hurt by my life again." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes dark with a decade of pain. "When your father's debt fell into my lap, I saw an opportunity, not just for legitimacy, but for you. I told myself it was a business transaction, That I could have you in my house, see you every day, and keep my heart locked away. That I would be protecting you by keeping my distance. It was the most foolish bargain I've ever made. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, hot and silent. The room, she whispered. Beatrice's room. It wasn't a shrine to her memory, he said, his voice thick with regret. It was a prison for mine. It was a reminder of my greatest failure. When you went in there, I wasn't angry at you. I was terrified. You were breaking through the walls I'd built to keep you safe, to keep myself from feeling. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching her cheek, his touch as soft as a whisper. I didn't want a replacement for Beatrice. I wanted Evelyn, and the thought of you, with a man like Sterling, the thought of him hurting you, it was a price I was not willing to pay. The truth, in its simple, staggering power, filled the space between them. He hadn't been honoring a ghost. He had been shackled to his own guilt. His coldness hadn't been a rejection of her, but a misguided, desperate attempt to protect her. I thought you hated me, she confessed, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. That I was just a name you had purchased. No, he said, his thumb gently wiping the tear away. Never that. I just didn't know how to be the man you deserved. The man in the light, in the quiet of the library, with the storm outside abating. The marriage of convenience dissolved, swept away by the raw, unvarnished truth. In its place, something new and fragile and incredibly powerful began to grow. It was not the poetic, naive love she had once dreamed of with men like Walter Sterling. It was something forged in fire and fear, built on a foundation of secrets and scars. It was real. Months passed. The city healed from the brief, violent gang war that followed Walter Sterling's demise. A war Arthur orchestrated from his sickbed with ruthless efficiency, consolidating his power and finally bringing a brutal, lasting peace to his underworld empire. But inside the mansion on the hill, a different kind of peace was settling. The ghost of Beatrice was finally laid to rest. One bright morning, Evelyn and Arthur, his arm now free of its sling, packed away the contents of the locked room together. It was not an erasure, but a gentle farewell. They kept the book of poetry and the photograph of the smiling girl, placing them on the library mantel, a part of Arthur's history, no longer a barrier to his future. The scene that fall was one of quiet domesticity that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The gramophone in the grand ballroom was playing a slow, melodic jazz tune, the saxophone weaving a story of sweet, languid love. The vast, empty space was no longer a stage for public performance, but a private haven. Arthur stood by the French doors, watching the last of the autumn leaves drift down onto the lawn. He turned as Evelyn entered the room. She was wearing a simple velvet dress the color of wine, and her smile, when she saw him, was genuine and filled with a light that reached the very back of the cavernous hall. He held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Corrigan?" he asked, a rare, gentle humor in his voice. "I thought it was a marriage on paper only, Mr. Corrigan," she teased, placing her hand in his. "I have found the terms of that arrangement to be unsatisfactory," he murmured, pulling her close. He led her onto the polished floor, his hand resting warm and firm on the small of her back. It was not a gesture of ownership anymore, but one of tenderness, of partnership. They began to dance, moving slowly, perfectly in sync to the rhythm of the music. Her head rested against his shoulder, the one that no longer bore a wound, and she felt the steady, strong beat of his heart. The mansion was no longer a gilded cage. It was simply a home. The fortune, the power, the fear he commanded in the city outside, all of it faded away, becoming the backdrop to their quiet, extraordinary world. They were two damaged, solitary souls from different worlds, brought together by a debt of money. But in the ruins of their pasts, they had found a far more profound currency. They had paid the debt with their hearts, and, in doing so, had purchased a future neither had believed was possible, a symphony of a new dawn, played just for them. True love often flourishes in the most barren ground, challenging our perceptions of good and evil. It teaches us that a person's worth is not defined by their past or their reputation, but by their capacity for redemption and sacrifice. The greatest debts are not paid with money, but with courage, trust, and the willingness to show the world the truth of one's heart. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.